I'll tell you why, because it doesn't sell. There is a reluctance, let us say, among historians and journalists who play historians on TikTok or are in their books they write, a reluctance to discuss the complicity of white men. And because the rape of enslaved women was committed by white men, that there are a whole bunch of people who don't want to get kicked out of their clubs that give them gigs, being part of the Thomas Jefferson Appreciation Club or the James Madison Appreciation Club. They would rather go to big auditoriums and sit on stages and go on CNN or whatever and be able to talk about James Madison and the difference between a republic and a democracy and about what the founders would have thought about it, not the fact that in 1776, 10% of the American population are enslaved women, subject to sexual violence every single day of their lives. And that number just grows over the next 80 years. 10% of the population. And we have evidence about what is happening. And some people will say, well, there's a lack of primary sources. No, there's not. We have two kinds of primary sources that speak directly to what's going on. One is in the population counts, is in the explosion in the 18th century of mixed race people. So the last time that I looked at it, we did a fairly in-depth study of it about 10 years ago and concluded ballpark that at the time of the American Revolution, a quarter of the Virginia population was mixed race. Just let that sink in. If 10% of the population is enslaved women, so 20% of the population is enslaved, so you've got 80% of the population, 40% of the population is free white men, a quarter of the population ends up being mixed race by the time of the Revolution. And then what we have are the first-person accounts of people who found mixed race relationships to be remarkable. We don't find a lot of primary sources that speak to this during the period by people who lived, again, in my area of Virginia, on the Chesapeake, for two reasons. One is that the Victorians destroyed a lot of stuff, but for what remains, that it was, to them, unremarkable. If you wake up and you're living in if you're living in 1776 in Virginia, the one thing that you're going to notice are all of the different colors of faces around you. It's the main thing that's going to hit you. It's going to, if you are in Williamsburg, it's going to be half the population. If you are in the Tidewater, it is going to be a majority of the population. You've got to go to the Piedmont. You've got to go to other parts of Virginia in which white people tend to dominate the area, in which the number of people who own slaves, at least the rate of enslaved ownership, drops. But the shocking range of color that you see, that would be remarkable to somebody visiting. And we know that because it was remarkable to them, that they found it so new and different from their own experience that they remarked upon it. For people who lived there, it was unremarkable. This is just a part of their lives. That this sexual violence is occurring is something that what we do find is we have some evidence of how people are justifying it. Some people are blaming, by the way, enslaved women for it. And that's a conversation no historian really wants to have. Why? Because it gets them kicked out of the club. It's why we don't call Mount Vernon George Washington's home and slave quarters. It's why we don't call Mount Monticello Thomas Jefferson's home and slave quarters. It doesn't. While and why even Monticello, which does so well with this stuff, just has a separate Sally Hemings and slave life at Monticello tour. You don't get that on the main tour. You can kind of stumble into it. They're trying to do their best. Why? Because they don't want to get kicked out of the club. Most of the people who buy these books are white, and they're white men. Most of the people who are driving visitation are white, and they're driven by white men. They don't think it will pay for the party. And so they don't get invited to these cushy gigs to let's talk about Thomas Jefferson's political thought when you think about Thomas Jefferson as engaged in systematic rape. And you start with that instead. That's the problem. And so the other parts of this evidence we have are people who are visitors to revolutionary Virginia who are remarking about what's going on all around them. For example, we have a lot of people from England who are visiting Virginia, and we have all kinds of primary evidence about the results of this violence. And they are baffled by it. And so they always remark on it. But it rarely gets published, right? It rarely gets discussed. And so because of this, and still this is part of the major problem that we have in continuing to get early America and the American Revolution wrong, and why we completely get off the rails in trying to understand how we in fact got from then to now. Because we actively ignore, know it's there, but actively ignore issues like this. I guarantee you it will not show up in Ken Burns' new documentary about the American Revolution. I guarantee you that this is not something that's talked about in most of the commemorations of the 250th anniversary of the War for Independence. Oh, that really doesn't matter. It doesn't pay for the party, even though it is a major issue that we have to grapple with, we have to accept, and that we have to talk about all the time. Despite the fact that there's a reluctance to discuss the complicity of white men in this. That's the answer. And because that gets in the way of the celebratory myth of the American Revolution that is driving most of the historiography. Because you have to buy into the idea that it's the American Revolution that fuels the ideas of liberty and freedom that eventually result in abolition to make everybody feel happy and healthy. Rather than these are a whole bunch of miserable bastards who create the country they want, that keep these people underneath their heels in chains until forced to by other people with until forced to release them by other people with guns, and that's the American Civil War. There is your response for this morning. This is an important question, and I thank you very much for asking it because I think about it all the time. And the fact that, and I think that this is part of what divides academic historians, particularly academic historians of the Revolution, from public historians. As public historians, we have to encounter this stuff. We have to engage with this stuff. Why? Because it's real. We deal with a history that impacts people's lives today. Stories about the past that matter in the present that help us understand how we got from then to now. Academic historians don't have to do that. They can pick and choose. And then they can pick and choose what fuels their gigs. And whether they're academic historians or whether they're journalists who play historians, they can just avoid. And they can make sure that they don't have to engage. Like even like people who call themselves public historians in like the UK and stuff like that, that they're just historians in public, so they can shut off public engagement. And they can just kind of make their pronouncements and presentations and then retreat and never really have to engage. There's no public in their public history, right? Their public history is, I'm just going to put out my history into the public. Our public history is different. Our public history is about our audiences. Our public history is about having to engage and engaging what in fact happened, how we got from then to now. So this is one of the issues that I think is one of the most important things that we can be talking about. And for my period, it just gets worse as the rationales for keeping people enslaved get worse, because then people get to justify the worst kind of actions based upon those rationales. So in any case, this particular horror is real, and it was a part of their lived experience in ways that are absolutely unique. Even though no women are actually having it, no women are having a great experience in the 18th century. But there are some that are better than others. There's a scale on there if you're free. If you are an enslaved woman, then it sucks 24/7 in ways that are horrific. But we don't want to talk about it. Why? Because we don't want to discuss the complicity of white men. But we need to. So thank you for the question and giving me the opportunity to chat about it this morning. Obviously, I find it important.
Not having to talk about it definitely belittles someone's horrific experience, and of course he said it plainly. They don't want to discuss the complexity of white men and all the supremacy that's surrounding it. But the truth is true. Things should be written. If they did happen, they should just be written so that people know what exactly happened, as opposed to cherry picking on history.